My name is Lauren Gatus, and on behalf of the Save Our Standards Coalition, we are thrilled to welcome you all to our webinar on fighting the abuse of standard essential patents, or SEPs. Save Our Standards is a broad-based coalition of innovators, small businesses, associations, academics, consumer groups dedicated to reinforcing the FRAND, or the Fair, Reasonable, and Non-Discriminatory Licensing Commitment. We used to say that we were a coalition of over 30 members. We're thrilled to say that we're now a coalition of over 40 members. We've hit that milestone. And we have several of our members joining us for the panel and in the audience, so really appreciate you all tuning in. This week, we are so excited to be joined by Engine, which is a nonprofit organization that works with thousands of startups across the country to advocate for pro-startup and pro-entrepreneurship policy. Engine is one of our Save Our Standards members, and they are hosting patent quality this week. I'd really like to thank Jill Crosby from Engine, who will be one of our panelists later in the discussion. She came to us with this idea for having a webinar for Patent Quality Week, and we're really excited to talk about this important issue. SEPs are an issue that impact American businesses, consumers, but not everyone knows about them. We are thrilled to be able to have this educational webinar on how we combat SEP abuse. So what's a standard essential patent? What's a SEP? It kind of boils down to what even is a standard. So technical standards are voluntary common platforms that enable innovators to develop and consumers to use products that can reliably work together. So if you are watching this via Wi-Fi, which I imagine most of you are using a standard right now. Wi-Fi is a standard, like there are so many other standards across industries. Ensuring that companies use these standards on FRAND terms is critical for promoting competition, innovation, and consumer choice. Unfortunately, some standard essential patent holders leverage their position to lock out innovators from using these standardized solutions for key sectors, like the automotive or the semiconductor industries. But something that we'll talk about later is that this isn't just confined to certain sectors now. It's really impacting American businesses across the board. When abusive SEP holders demand excessive non-FRAND royalties or refuse to license, businesses and consumers lose. Because I know not everyone who's joining us today is even familiar with what a SEP is, which is great. We're really thrilled to have you. I'm going to turn it over to Save Our Standards member Alex Moss, who is the executive director of the Public Interest Patent Law Institute, or PIPLI, to give us a primer on what SEPs are for those of you who are joining us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And you gave a great intro to standards. I'm just going to give an example of what a standard is that we use every day, which is that there's a standard for electric plugs and outlets. And it's because there's a standard for electrical appliances that when consumers go to buy a coffee maker, I'm not worried about whether I'll be able to plug it in when I get home. And this is good for coffee makers because they can get to all possible consumers, not just the ones that have the outlets that work with their plugs. And it means that consumers get to pick based on features they care about a whole lot more than the plug, like is the pot going to keep my coffee hot? And so by kind of taking the standards piece off the table, it means that the companies can then actually compete and innovate around those features that consumers actually care about and like, instead of being like, hey, check out our jazzy AC plug. So everybody in this scenario wins from standards, consumers, the product makers. Now, what are standard essential patents, or SEPs? Those are patents that claim aspects of standards, and they're primarily in the sort of computer and information space, where a lot of the standards, they're basically standards for everything with how computerized devices communicate with each other. We talk a lot about Wi-Fi or LTE standards for wireless communication, but MP3, that's a file format standard. .doc is a file format standard. So pretty much whenever you have computers dealing with data, there's going to be at least one standard, probably many involved. And these standards are huge and extremely complex and long. And so there are many, many tens of thousands, maybe on 5G, we're at the hundreds of thousands, but certainly tens of thousands on 4G in terms of the number of patents that cover an aspect of the standard. And for a long time, there actually weren't SEPs at all because standard development organizations just said no to patented technology. Companies get together to develop the standard, and the organizations that coordinate it said, we want to make sure access is the goal. And there then was sort of we could characterize it differently, but an allowance for patent owners to get fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory royalties, which we call FRAND. So many SDOs, though not all, and actually the internet standards are a great example of one that has remained patent-free throughout their history. But many standard development organizations require participants to promise that any patents they have or get, which read on the standard, they will license on FRAND, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms. The catch is that while this sounds like a good idea, we have never agreed on what FRAND means. And the fights and range of meanings has only expanded over time at the same time as standards have become even more critical to our daily life, as more devices are interconnected, more devices use standards, and the standards get more complex and the number of patents that are essential to the standards grow. So the fights over FRAND have just multiplied through the present. And I'll turn it over there if that's a good start.
That was really helpful. Appreciate you laying that groundwork for us as we move into our conversations about why SEPs are important and how SEP abuse impacts industries. Um, Welcome to Jill and to Carol, our other esteemed panelists today. Before we kick off the conversation, I'm just gonna say we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat or into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the conversation. Jill, I'm gonna start with you because you are the host of Patent Quality Week. So it would be great if you could introduce yourself, introduce Engine. Tell us more about Patent Quality Week and also just why standard essential patents are important to your members.
Great, yeah, of course. So I'm Jill Crosby, Policy Counsel at Engine. And Patent Quality Week is an annual initiative we're relaunching to highlight the importance of a strong, balanced patent system. And in today's interconnected world where technologies are increasingly relying on shared standards, clear and fair rules around standard essential patents are especially important. And when thinking of standard essential patents, startups in particular have a lot at stake here because high quality SEPs are important tools for companies building technologies that depend on interoperability, whether it's wireless communications, smart devices, or connected infrastructure. And these standards help ensure that new products can enter the market and work seamlessly with existing technologies. And again, this idea of SEPs making it easier for innovators to build on what's already out there. But ultimately, startups, we need a predictable environment where licensing and standards don't come with unnecessary complexity or risk, or where the rules for using SEPs are transparent and fair. And that kind of balance helps support competition, expand innovation. And that's why SEPs is so essential to Patent Quality Week, because again, this impacts all industries. We're ultimately all stakeholders, and this is key to building more innovation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill. Carol is another member of Save Our Standards. Carol is with Schneider Electric. And it would be great, Carol, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about why Schneider cares about SEPs. And maybe give us an example of how standards have contributed to your industry. Alex talked about connectivity standards, but really this standards are across the board. So it would be great to hear from you there.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for joining this webinar. I'm bringing in kind of the implementer's perspective, and I think looking through somewhat of the lens of my career path, you can see how standards have impacted a lot of aspects of our lives and how they're impacting a company like Schneider Electric now, which I think is actually really relevant to small and medium enterprises. Even though that Schneider Electric is a 150-year-old mature company, we're new to this area of digital energy. and how they're all everything is being interconnected and communicating. But going back, I spent 10 years in the military, and one of the projects I worked on when I was in the Air Force was GPS, which to me is a really cool standard because everybody uses it to connect to where's your location. But it's not monetized because that is one area of innovation that the government has funded up front. And there's a lot of other different kinds of standards, as Lauren has put forward. I spent 10 years at Microsoft, which of course cares about the Wi-Fi and possible cellular connectivity of your operating system, but also the video that you might be using in your Teams application or in your media player application and in your Xbox. Then I spent 4 years at Lenovo, which was looking at the cellular connectivity and again, the Wi-Fi and the video codecs, which are all highly monetized. Now at Schneider Electric, you can also look at the breadth of the various standards that are circuit breakers, our electric vehicle charging stations, our medium voltage transformers. We comply with a lot of standards, hundreds of standards, even thousands of standards, but not all of them are monetized in the way that cellular, Wi-Fi, or video and audio are currently. But you can see the trend going in that direction. But going back to the point of now everything is getting connected because of interoperability in smart homes, smart manufacturing. You put smart in front of everything. Heck, even my cat has a robot feeder that I can connect to my Wi-Fi, right? And so all of that connectivity, as Alex rightly pointed out, is based upon the ground level or the baseline of a standard to allow that connectivity, to allow that innovation downstream, whether it's a robot cat feeder or whether it's a circuit breaker to allow you insight into seeing how you're spending energy in your home and can meter or mark that, or even build a smart feedback loop that will then help control your air conditioning when a room is not being occupied. You can see how this connectivity is everywhere. It's in our light bulbs, it's in our cars, it's in our watches. And this is only going to continue as AI and as computing and data centers become more accessible. But going back to the point of the question isn't, should standards essential patents exist? Yes. Should those who implement those standards pay a fair and reasonable royalty, FRAND royalty rate? Yes. The question is, what is that price? And that's where the real difficulty comes in. And if you look at it from the point of view of the patent owners, and I've been on the side of patent owners, both Lenovo and Microsoft have been patent owners as well as implementers. And so I don't want to say I have a balanced perspective, but I see both sides of the coin. But the thing is that if you look at it from the patent owner's perspective, they'll say, well, why don't implementers just take a license? And the implementers are like, I want to take a license. I just don't know how much it will cost or how to tell my executives it will cost X dollars. And if you look at the current plethora of, how do I say, litigation cases, whether it's in the US or Germany or the UK or China, there's a huge gap there that is not necessarily closable with honest and good faith negotiation. We've had, patent owners saying it's $9 a product. Other ones say it's 0.05 cents a product. That's a really big gap when you're talking about millions of products being sold worldwide to close with negotiation. And that's where, again, going back to what Jill was saying about transparency and predictability is essential. That's not meant as a joke. It's actually critical for negotiations to go forward on a relationship of trust.
That was really, really great, Carol, and really insightful. And it lends well to the next question I have on my list. Alex, can you maybe dive into a bit more on what exactly the FRAND commitment is and why it is so important, like Carol was just discussing?
Sure. So FRAND commitments are what companies that participate in developing standards in many standard development organizations have to make as a condition to participate. So there, a whole range of companies participate in standard setting, including many that are competitors. So there are concerns that there could be exclusion from the market that with real legal consequences. And one of the ways to ensure this doesn't happen is to say, okay, well, you promise you're going to license anyone who wants a license on fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms. But these standard development organizations overwhelmingly do not define what that means. And notably, one of the terms, at least reasonable, is actually already in the law as to what patent owners can get in litigation. They get no less than a reasonable royalty. But there's not a right to unreasonable royalties through litigation. So fair and non-discriminatory become really, really important. And the problem is, though, when it comes to figuring out what these terms actually mean, and really critically, whether, right, a rate is FRAND, there are some questions or tactics like saying no to certain types of licensees, where that's one type of question of, is that fair and non-discriminatory? And there's debate over that. But certainly when it comes to figuring out, is a particular amount fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory, that's a hugely complicated question. And FRAND really that word doesn't say anything about what the number is going to be or even what criteria should be used. And often these standards typically have so many patents in them. And what can be one of the big dangers is that if you've got every patent owner getting the most amount that they can possibly get, and the implementers to pay each one of them, that they're going to add up to more than the cost of making the product. It's going to make using the standard so expensive that the implementers won't use it. This is something called royalty stacking. And so at the very least, many think that FRAND is supposed to prevent this problem. And many courts, though not all, as a result, when they have applied it, take what's called a top-down approach, where they think kind of at a first level, okay, well, what would be a reasonable royalty for access to all the patents in the standard? And then of that, how much do we apportion to these that are in the particular case? But as Carol said, one of the challenges implementers face is they don't know how much to pay, is that there's not one way to get the license to the whole set of standard essential patents. These are all separate negotiations. So they don't know, even when they say yes to one, that doesn't mean, that doesn't actually say the total cost of what they're paying. And potentially, if they're saying yes a little too easily, it's going to put a big target on them to say, hey, everybody else, come here, there's an easy mark. So there's a real problem in practice because of the uncertainty around what FRAND means, and the fact that the way we resolve this uncertainty is through litigation, which is hugely expensive. And so, one thing, I can say is that some of the biggest winners in the current system are patent lawyers. Because this is a way that almost, whether it's a negotiation or a litigation, you have to have lawyers involved that are very expensive, and really, that's money that if we had more clarity could be going to innovation.
I agree, Alex, 100%. And it's especially impactful for small and medium enterprises that may not even have a chief IP counsel on their, in their staff, and may not even have one that's an expert in standards essential patents. As we've seen here, it's a niche and specialized process, and you have to outsource for that expertise. And that puts a huge burden on small and medium enterprises, as well as uncertainty, which then means they can make the choice of, you know what, this is just too much risk. We're going to go in a different direction. And that doesn't help innovation for a product, and it doesn't help US manufacturing either. It's just something I've seen as I've worked in startups as well.
I'm just going to jump, to compound that unfairness to small and medium companies, and is to say, Carol's right. So they often, are not going to be the fiercest negotiators because they're not going to have millions, hundreds of millions to throw away on litigation. And SEP owners know that. So they go to them first and they get deals. And maybe it ends up that the whole total payment isn't so much, but they've put a royalty figure, a rate in there. That's actually quite high. But the company's pretty small, so maybe they've flattened it out to a lump sum that's a little different, and it's reasonable. But now when that SEP owner goes to a big company, one of the big pieces of evidence that courts will use to figure out what's reasonable is they'll say, what are your deals with others? What's everybody else paying? And then you take this high royalty rate that you got off a small company and say, this is what people are paying. And so the unfairness to small companies is actually sort of incentivized because it's a useful way to have more leverage against big companies.
That's a really great segue into what we wanted to discuss next, which my colleague Bella is going to share her screen with a graphic that we've put together that is the first resource on the Save Our Standards website. If you go to our resources tab, and something we talk about at Save Our Standards is how this SEP abuse, this litigation, can happen at any point in the life cycle of a product. It can happen at the investment phase. It can happen when a product is being developed, and it can happen even moments before a product hits a shelf. And so, as we were just discussing, this can be particularly harmful for small businesses. And so, Jill, I'd love to turn it to you to talk about that and how SEP abuse impacts companies in innovating and bringing new products to market, especially startups.
Yeah, no, for sure. Startups, I would say most encounter SEPs as downstream implementers. So they're the companies that are building the new products and need to use standardized technology, as Carol and Alex have said, like wireless connectivity or smart device interoperability to do so. And in these situations, SEP policy has a direct impact on whether a startup can even get off the ground, honestly. Because when SEP enforcement is out of balance, and particularly when SEP holders are either threatening injunctions or demanding excessive royalties going against the FRAND commitment, it creates real barriers to entry because many startups, like they only have just one or two core products or services. So if a SEP holder can threaten to block that product or service from the market, even if the startup is willing to pay a fair licensing fee, that will be enough to entirely shut down an entire company. So startups typically, as we were saying, don't have the legal budgets or leverage to navigate, say, drawn out litigation to try and fight this. So that's also a point as to why FRAND commitments are so important and should be enforced. And as you were saying, Lauren, this doesn't just happen like at the start of the life cycle. It can surface at the early stages of a company when they're seeking funding that can prevent them from having investors invest in their company. During development, they can decide to no longer go with a new innovative idea. It really affects startups and small businesses a lot, but also those that goes downstream to the consumers then and what products are then available in the market.
And Carol, that was a really great explanation. And there's the products that hit the shelves, there's the product development. Carol, you were talking when we were chatting yesterday about this. This can wreak havoc on manufacturing and development. And
Right.
yeah, if you
Want me to go into your graphic doesn't have the keyword jobs.
yes, jobs.
Exactly. And that's kind of what opened the eyes at my leadership here at Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric, as I said, is a very mature company, lots of hardware and electronic area. And as they have been starting to build in more connectivity, they hired me in to help manage this risk and what's our plan going forward. And that's kind of been my directive. But as I went to management, they all knew, oh, this could potentially be litigated. There could be a stop on sales. There's revenues or royalties related to this. But Carol, you'll handle it. And I was like, wait a minute, time out. If we get an injunction, which is a big legal term, that doesn't just mean a stop on sales, a stop on importing, or stop on exporting. It's also a stop on manufacturing. You have to stop within that jurisdiction. And this has led to some large companies to withdraw their manufacturing from Germany, which is a highly litigious, easy jurisdiction to get an injunction. And I will say that my leadership did not quite understand that that's the major risk behind standards essential patent, that you will have a product, let's say like an EV charger, that will have thousands of features on it and also be related to hundreds of standards about voltages and currents and how do we connect to the car and how do we charge rates and all of those types of things and the safety to the consumer. But really what we're getting charged for or demand letters from is for there to be Wi-Fi or cellular connectivity, embedded in the product that may or may not be used, because I would say more than 80% of EV chargers are in parking garages 5 stories underground in a concrete structure. There's no cellular down there. but we build it in the product and we understand that there's reliability. But telling my management that this can affect manufacturing, the response was, wait, what do we do with those people if we can't manufacture? And that's exactly the question. And that's exactly the risk. And that's exactly the leverage that SEP or Standard Essential Patent owners use, as Alex said, to close deals with rates that are abnormally higher than what would normally be, how to say, closed during, good faith negotiations. And it's that leverage that people's jobs in manufacturing are on the line. That's the leverage that Ford caved to, and that's the leverage that others have caved to in the past. And it's a lot of leverage, which is why the eBay factors are so important in the US, and why they need to be considered in the EU proposals that are going on that hopefully will add more predictability on the EU side. But it's that stability of, how do I say it, a predictability of an injunction in the US that has allowed Schneider Electric to say, yeah, we'll make a $700 million bet in growth of our manufacturing and R&D here in the US, because the US currently has a predictable injunction in manufacturing environment. That's not necessarily true in other jurisdictions. And if that becomes more uncertain, then that you'll see, as Alex pointed out, you'll see a reduction, and as Jill pointed out, a reduction in investment in those opportunities because the risk is too high.
And I'm just going to hop into, since you mentioned the Ford example, we actually have a white paper out where research was done to assess what, so in the Ford case, Ford was sued in Germany, among other places, for not being a willing enough licensee of patents on, I believe that these were 5G patents in the case. And the court in this district of Germany has a very quick preliminary injunction, an automatic one. And so they were facing a potential injunction, and pardon my dog objecting to the delivery, but Ford quickly settled. And what our paper looks at is what was the threat of that injunction in terms of revenue, but also in terms of jobs. And in that one, I think it's about 1,500 full-time jobs that were at stake, in addition to the amount of money. And this was and that was just in Germany. And so one thing I'll bring this back to is, because this is Patent Quality Week, that one of the ways that patent quality really matters is that when we have low quality US patents, by which I mean patents that shouldn't have issued, and those are declared essential to a standard, that the threat they pose is really just to US entities, because people outside the US can't be sued for infringing them. So really the low quality patent SEPs, the ones that shouldn't exist, that really are obvious, aren't novel, those really disproportionately threaten US companies and workers. And so that's a real reason why the quality of SEPs is something that people in the US should be concerned about.
So how can we deal with SEP abuse? And that is quite a loaded question, and I think I'll ask that of all of you.
Yeah, I think Jill has been quiet. I'd like to give her a chance, because
yeah.
I can suck up the air in the room, but I do have opinions on a lot of things. But I would love to hear from the other people first.
Yeah, Jill, if you want to, especially, since it is Patent Quality Week.
Yeah, I mean, where do you even start with that question? I'll always bring it back to the small business startup perspective. I feel like when you're looking at SEPs, I mean, it is a very technical niche issue, but at the end of the day, when you're considering the policy impacts, you need to be considering all the players in the ecosystem. And the stakeholders in this case are not just the large businesses that are often at the forefront of these conversations. It's also the small businesses, the startups, and then ultimately the consumers. And a truly balanced system needs to reflect the reality of all these different participants. And we need to be considering not just, say, one licensing abuse to a larger company. We need to consider the fact that this can be entirely detrimental, shutting down smaller companies. But that's where I'll start off right there, considering all the different stakeholders.
I'll hop in with sort of three ways of addressing the problem from different ends. One is definitely stem the tide of low quality patents that are declared essential to standards. One study found that 84% of continuation patent applications, which are patents that are filed after an original patent application, that those 84% of them that are SEPs were actually applied for after the standard had been published. And that's a huge number. And it's really, if the standard had already been published, it really strongly suggests that many of those patents shouldn't have issued. And so that's something to look at. Maybe it's the abuse of continuations, or it's the application of the standards, but stem the tide by reducing the flow of patents that shouldn't exist. Two, increase access to information to reduce the cost of gathering information and the unnecessary litigation that happens because of lack of access to information. Now, there's a lot of things that implementers don't know, but really at a basic level, they should know what the standard essential patents are, and really specifically, they should know what claims are they going to be accused of infringing. So there should at least be some system of registering the patents and registering the owners and registering the patents that are associated with the standard, so that implementers can have a sense. And maybe there's some provision for folks to assert them separately from this, but that there's some presumption or some limit. We have similar things in copyright, where you have to register your copyright before you bring certain types of claims for damages. There should be some sense of what the universe is, so that implementers aren't just completely operating in the dark. And then third is, this is the thing, bilateral litigation that we have in the US is a horrible way to deal with a problem that is a collective goods problem, right? Implementers don't need actually a license to your patent. They need a license to all of the SEPs. And no one SEP owner has the power to give it. And the other thing is that the terms of that dispute, if we're thinking about what's the significance of that patent to the overall standard, that decision is relevant to many entities beyond the plaintiff or the defendant. That's going to be all the other implementers, potentially to users, potentially to regulators. So we really need some adjudication system that is not two-party litigation, and where some form of dispute resolution, whether it's deciding, like we have the Copyright Royalty Board, if there's a board that sets royalties, or if there's a process that at some point prior to early in the standards release that all the parties can participate in. But there needs to be a more efficient and fair alternative to bilateral litigation in terms of how to resolve these issues, either before or after they arise.
I'll add two more points on that. Getting to the predictability and the transparency portion of it is ahead of time, when I or my company or any other company is looking to build a product, there has to be some guess about how much that will cost, so I can build that into my pricing profile. If I'm building a product and then my executive vice president comes to me and says, Carol, we're building in Wi-Fi, and we're going to put in WiMAX, or Wi-Fi 6. How much will that cost, and how do we build that into the price that we sell to the customer to make sure that Schneider Electric makes some incremental profit and investment for our shareholders? I have a hard time answering that, because we don't know what that rate is worldwide. I don't know what the global cap is for Wi-Fi 6, because every patent owner can come in with their own interpretation of FRAND. And is that going to be $30? Is that going to be $12? Or will that be $4? I don't know. And it all depends. And that's such a lawyer cop-out answer. And I fully admit that, being a lawyer, and I apologize. But it really needs to be in a regulated environment that allows that predictability going forward. But also, not only that, we need to build trust amongst the patent owners and those who implement. There's so much angst about, no, they're holding out. No, they're holding up the negotiation. There's one proceeding in the UK called a pre-litigation proceeding, where each of the parties can bring in their confidential information and give it to a court-hired expert. And then a court-hired expert will say, Yeah, and Lenovo did this during one of their suits with InterDigital. The court-hired expert said, Lenovo, we're not going to tell you what a FRAND rate is, but we will tell you that the rate that InterDigital is offering you is beyond the rate that their other customers are paying for their patents. And that's very informative to the Lenovo executives, to the negotiations that were going on between Lenovo and InterDigital. And this is, I did not gain this information when I was at Lenovo. This is all just from the press releases. But having a proceeding like that can give you a level of trust about, yes, this rate that's being offered by a patent owner, let's just say Samsung or Huawei or Qualcomm, is well within the rates that they're offering their other customers. That's a very powerful message for me to bring to my executive VP for sign-off to close a deal ahead of time before we get to Alex's point of litigation or even mediation. So I'm all for building trust and openness and transparency in the negotiation so that we can offer a license. The second point is pools. We haven't mentioned that word yet. A pool is basically a bunch of patent owners joining together. It's rarely 100% of the, how to say, global portfolio for patents related to that standard. But many patent owners will join together and put their patents in a pool and hire an administrator to say, look, you can get a license to 50 patent owners if you take a license to the pool. The concern, this has worked well in the past with phones and laptops because those are kind of a spectrum of products. As that diversity of products happens, let's say like Schneider Electric, we have over 20,000 different product offerings in the Schneider Electric family. And so when, let's say, a pool operator comes to Schneider Electric and says, yes, we'll offer you a license for 50 patent owners for your EV chargers, because they've compartmentalized their pool to be EV chargers, but not sensors and not smart meters and not these other products that I have in my portfolio, that doesn't really help me because I still need to close licenses for the depth and breadth of my products. And so pools can be good solutions, but they have to be administered and structured in a way that meets the needs of the marketplace. And that's not necessarily the same. And I think it's going to be more of a challenge as the diversity of products that are connected and use the monetized standards more integral. As I say, it's everything from robot feeders to EV chargers and in between.
Thanks, Carol. I will turn over now to some audience questions. We have one. Folks, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or chat them directly to me. One question we got is how does AI play into all this? AI is sort of the buzzword of today. Curious if anyone has thoughts on SEPs and AI.
I'll give two different interpretations. One, I'm one of the co-chairs for the Licensing Executive Society for Standards Essential Patents. Ericsson and Huawei are also part of that kind of leadership team. And we just had our initial kickoff last month. And what was interesting to me that it wasn't just cellular, it wasn't just Wi-Fi, which are the most litigated ones out there, along with video and audio, but AI was attending, and so was quantum computing. And it was interesting to me that there is discussion of expanding the monetized standards to include AI. Standards around AI may be monetized. Standards around quantum computing can be monetized. And there's even a pool now that is monetizing, as I said, just the voltage, characteristics of an EV charger. And so the number of standards that are being considered for negotiation and further litigation is expanding very, very quickly. Also, as both an owner and an implementer in my past roles, using AI, it's not there yet to build claim charts or to check essentiality, but it will get there soon enough that we'll hopefully be able to start getting into this quality issue about what standards really, what patents really are essential to the standard, and hopefully automate that. But it's going to take years to train models to do that, and we need to start now. And I think the US, being an AI leader, needs to be the first ones to embrace that within our USPTO and within our IP practice and profession. Now is the time, because it takes years to train those models, and then we'll be there at the lead when the time comes.
Yeah, and then I would just like to build off the magnitude of what Carol was just saying. The consideration that we're going to start including AI into SEP consideration. Most of the startups we work with at Engine are very much AI companies. So that just means more downstream potential downstream impacts to very small companies, startups, which makes it even more important right now to kind of deconstruct this topic, understand it, more important towards transparency. So then at the forefront, they know that they're using a SEP. So they will have to, in terms of their resources, pricing, time, be aware of that AI involved in potentially SEPs moving forward.
I just happen to say that there are, it is important, sometimes when we talk about standards in AI, people are talking really about like ethical standards in terms of like what should be sort of the standards for that people use when creating AI systems. And those are probably less likely, but not definitely not to be monetized. But really, anytime we are going to be talking about AI modules communicating data with each other or with devices or with users, as that there are going to be standards. And you know, they may be ones that, you know, develop. In fact, the keyboard layout, the QWERTY keyboard layout is a standard that developed de facto. One company had that, you know, standard, and people used it. And once you've learned how to type, right, you're locked in. You're not really going to switch. So even if it's just that there are maybe standards that develop because of how we communicate and use AI, but what, you know, I would say no matter what, there are going to be standards. They could be de facto, but I'm quite sure that they will be a de jure, which means there will be standard setting organizations creating them, which means there will be companies who can say or acquire patents that read on them and who are going to want to monetize them. So this is just a, you know, we're at the brink, and certainly like the storm is coming.
The storm is definitely coming on AI. I think we all feel that every day with the news on AI and just I know myself, I've been using it more and more. So that is quite the way to put it. Question we got, this is more of a legal question. Would you be able to adjudicate a FRAND rate in district court with one or more of the SEP owners? This would set a proper FRAND rate, right? Why do we not see more of these FRAND rate adjudications in US District Court?
And that is such a good question. It has been done. And there was an important case that where Judge Robards decided involving Microsoft. And that actually became a really important decision, not just for the FRAND rate set in that case, but for how to set a FRAND rate. There are the problem with so one problem is that by the time you get to the court and you get the litigation over the standard, it is probably long after that standard was commercially relevant. I worked on a case where we were involved with expired MP3 patents. So the court, you didn't set a FRAND rate, the case ultimately settled, but if it had, it would have been irrelevant. So one problem is just the timing of litigation. The other, though, is that there are all like the other parties, whether it's the SEP owners or the implementers, they're not going to say that applies to us. Their products are different, their bargaining status is different, their patents are different, the standard is different. Lawyers are always going to find a way to distinguish, especially patent lawyers. Now, and certainly probably also the litigated case is going to involve a very big company. So it's not necessary. There probably actually are reasons that make it not all that useful for smaller or medium-sized companies, the ones that can't litigate. And then I would last note that when you have disputes that arise with an existing licensee, there may be an existing agreement in place that requires secret arbitration to resolve any disputes. And so if there's a decision in arbitration, that will be completely non-public and secret, and nobody will know what the court decided if it was relevant. So there are a number of factors, but it is a really good point. And certainly when courts do decide these issues, the way that they decide them is often very, very relevant to courts really around the world considering these issues because there are so few of them.
Yeah, Alex, on top of that, I think there's a bunching or a pooling aspect. It's not the pools per se, but let's say, I don't know, let's just pick a patent owner and let's just say Huawei. You know, it's one of the biggest patent owners for 4G and 5G. They could sue Schneider Electric and Lenovo for violating 4G or implementing 4G. And they could sue both of us for the same time. Let's just say in the Eastern District of Texas, to pick a random litigious jurisdiction out of the air. But what would never happen would be that, let's say, Schneider Electric would adjudicate a FRAND rate with both Huawei and Qualcomm at the Eastern District of Texas at the same time. Because it's not, as you pointed out, it's not the same issue in dispute because they have such different patents and they would not be adjudicated at the same time. The court would be very unlikely to join them. Have you seen a case where there's multiple SEP patent owners adjudicating together in a unified FRAND rate against a single implementer? I haven't seen that, but it might be just my inexperience.
I mean, why would you deprive the opportunity to inflict more litigation costs? Why?
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's was one aspect of the question I wanted to point out, is that would just never happen because the patent owners would dispute that it's the same issues at interest, and they each were due their day in court. And as Alex pointed out, each lawyer is going to have their own 28 different reasons why they're different from the other. You know, it's like going back to the Muppets, you know, one of these things is not like the other, or maybe that was the electric company. I can't remember, but yeah.
We have two questions that I'm gonna conflate them, and as not a lawyer, that might be the wrong way to approach this, but we are coming up a bit on time, so I want to make sure we are able to answer them. So the second of the two questions is, do you believe that there's a distinction between standard setting, picking one arbitrary technology among many as a standard, versus standard development? Where parties put resources towards developing a standard. And then another question we got, which I think is probably related, is do companies like Schneider Electric contribute to the standards or merely implement them? If commercially developed standards are not feasible, is there interest to develop proprietary standards? So I will throw that out there for the lawyers to discuss.
Let's do the short one first about SDOs versus SSOs. I don't know, me being a lazy lawyer, I think I use them interchangeably. I think as we get down to the purpose, as you've rightly pointed out in the question, there is a slight difference between a standard setting organization or one that actually commits R&D to develop a standard. But oftentimes the result is the same, whether it's an SSO or an SDO. There's a patent commitment among the members of whether it's FRAND or whether it's a zero royalty. And so I think the result is the same, whatever it is, and people tend to use them pretty interchangeably. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know.
And yeah, I would agree. I think that even if you're a standard development organization that is developing standards, there are going to be some things that exist that you take. And so I think that the idea that you're using existing technology, that in any sort of modern standard is so complex that you couldn't really build it from scratch. And so, you know, I tend to think that the two activities are very, very closely intertwined. And that even also, if you started as an SDO, then if you're maintaining that standard over time, it might maybe now you're not developing it as much, you're just sort of tweaking it and maintaining it. So I think it's reasonable to use them interchangeably, although, you know, certainly there are important differences and unique features of different organizations in the standard setting space.
Yeah. All right, Lauren, do you want me to jump to the other? Jill, did you want to add anything to the SSO versus SDO? Otherwise, I would jump to the other question.
Yeah, that would be great, Carol.
So I'm going to answer like a lawyer and say it depends, which I know is the cop-out answer. Yes, we contribute to standards. Companies like Schneider Electric contribute to standards, and we implement standards. And when I worked at startups, we contributed to standards, and some standards we implemented. You know, it comes down to the basic question, as any manufacturing or development company does: are you going to build it or are you going to buy it? right? And so you do the same thing with standards. Am I going to build 5G, or am I just going to buy it and rely on the, great expertise of Nokia, Ericsson, Qualcomm, and others? And then there'll be other things that I will build. Let's say we're very active in hundreds of standards organizations. It's just that Schneider Electric is not currently involved in standards organizations that are often monetized. Many of them are what we call RAND-Z, or what we call zero royalty, with a reasonable and non-discriminatory zero royalty commitment. And companies like Schneider Electric, like Siemens, like ABB, and like a lot of others in my industry are all committed to develop I don't want to call it a proprietary standard, but it's not necessarily an open standard, but it's an interoperability standard that we're all buying into, so that our products and our customers can build across a platform for complex systems, whether it's a manufacturing floor, or whether it's a hotel, or whether it's a utility, or whether it's a home, or anything else. It's those standards that allows products in the marketplace to not only compete, but also to interoperate. And yes, there is a huge interest to develop those standards, because then we can all play in the same marketplace. We don't want to be boxed out.
I think that's a great place for us to start to wrap things up there. I would love to turn to each of the three of you for any final thoughts that you have you want to share with our audience. I'll save Jill for last, since this is a Patent Quality Week event. So Carol or Alex, take it away.
I'll just say thank you to everybody for inviting me and for listening. And if you ever want to talk deeply about patents, you can tell I'm very passionate about it. But again, my comments are my own personal ones, and not necessarily the public statement of Schneider, Lenovo, or Microsoft, or even the United States Air Force, if you go all the way back. But obviously, it's been those experiences that have fed into this, and I hope it's helpful to you.
Yes, thank you everyone, especially everyone who's for Save Our Standards for throwing this, for Engine for doing Patent Quality Week, and for everyone who's spending time thinking and listening about standards. As you can tell, I think standards are hugely important, and that we can't take them for granted, and that the truth is, when standards work, we don't notice, and we only have problems when there's a problem when they don't work. So the fact that so many of us are talking about standards really is a sign in itself that the market of licensing is broken. And even though we've talked about a lot of problems, I do want to leave a sort of hopeful note, is that in theory, it doesn't have to, in my view, be this contentious, and certainly not forever. This is a space where, with standards, everybody should win by having there be more access and use of the standard. The more suppliers are using the standard, the more licensing fees are going to standard essential patent holders. The more suppliers that are using the standard, the more choice consumers have, and the more that companies then are innovating on other things, and the things that actually drive consumer decisions. So this actually is in my view really a collective action problem, where in fact the standard essential patent owners, because they're each individually doing what's in their own best interest, are not actually necessarily in the long term serving their interests, at least to the extent they start to reduce implementation of the standard. And one example of this is the online video codec space, where there has been such a high and challenging monetization that implementers did create an alternative that's royalty free, but there's still no actually default web online video codec that is used. And so there are examples where, ultimately excessive kind of rent seeking leads to the standard being deterring use of the standard. And the whole point of the standard is to have maximum use, maximum adoption. And so I think by focusing on that as the goal, which should benefit everybody, right? It's more users, more sales, more licensing fees. So if we keep that the goal, that there actually really should be a way in the long term to figure out a system that works for everyone.
Yeah, and then I guess going back to higher level, and thank you so much to Save Our Standards for hosting this webinar. I think it's really important that we recognize that ultimately we're all stakeholders in the US patent system, not just us, the IP attorneys, but from the businesses who are major players, as well as all the way down to the consumers who are actually using these products. And this is important to keep in mind, especially as we're about to have a new USPTO director welcomed in. And it's equally important for everyone to understand that the policy and legal landscape surrounding patents, specifically even standard essential patents, it's important that we stay informed and we continue to advocate for fair, balanced licensing practices because we all have a vital role to play, because this is so key to expanding innovation, which ultimately uplifts our economy.
I cannot think of a more perfect way to close this out. So thank you, Jill. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Carol. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I would encourage you all, if this is of interest to you, stay in touch with us, follow us on social media. Save Our Standard is on LinkedIn and X. And we look forward to having more conversations in the future. So thank you.